On the morning of October 14th, 2025, millions of computers around the world woke up to the same message. A full-screen pop-up, impossible to dismiss for long, informing the owner that their operating system had officially reached the end of its life. Windows 10, the version of Windows more people had used longer than almost any release in the platform's history, stopped receiving free security patches that day. No more monthly fixes, no more protection against newly discovered vulnerabilities, just a ticking clock on every unpatched machine still connected to the internet. For the people staring at that message, the panic was immediate and practical. Their laptops still worked fine. Their spreadsheets still opened, their video calls still connected, their kids' homework still printed. But Microsoft was telling them, in a full-screen dialogue they couldn't easily click away from, that continuing to use the machine they already owned now came with a quietly rising risk, and that the recommended fix was to buy a new one, ideally a Copilot Plus PC with dedicated AI hardware built in. For an estimated 240 million machines worldwide, according to research from Canalys, buying a new PC wasn't a suggestion. It was closer to a requirement. Those machines physically could not run Windows 11 no matter what their owners did, because they lacked a security chip called TPM 2.0, a component Microsoft had quietly made mandatory years earlier, and that most computers built before 2016 simply never shipped with. For a lot of ordinary people staring at that dialog box, the sudden calculation felt almost unfair. Nobody had asked these machines to become obsolete. They still ran the same programs they'd always run, opened the same files, connected to the same networks. What changed wasn't the hardware sitting on the desk. What changed was a corporate decision made years earlier about which security chip a computer had to contain in order to remain officially welcome on the platform it had run its entire life. That single date, October 14th, 2025, is where the story actually begins. Not with a scrappy underdog operating system slowly winning converts over years, with a hard deadline, a wall of incompatible hardware, and a specific piece of software that happened to launch on the exact same day the wall went up. That software was called Zorin OS 18. The timing was not a coincidence anyone stumbled into. The Zorin Group, a small development team that had been quietly refining a Windows-styled version of Linux for more than a decade, released version 18 on October 14th, 2025, the same morning Microsoft's support clock ran out. They had teased the release the previous month, watching the deadline approach the way a surfer watches a wave build before it breaks, and they timed the launch to land at the exact moment hundreds of millions of people were being told their current setup was no longer safe. Within 48 hours, it had been downloaded roughly 100,000 times. Within about 5 weeks, on November 18th, 2025, the Zorin Group announced it had crossed 1 million downloads, and more than 78% of those installs had originated from machines that were already running Windows. Not curious Linux hobbyists hopping between distributions they already understood, people fleeing an operating system that had just told them their time was up. By January 12th, 2026, under 3 months after launch, that number had doubled again to 2 million downloads. And when the Zorin team shipped its first point release, Zorin OS 18.1, on April 15th, 2026, exactly 6 months after the original launch, they announced the total had climbed to more than 3.3 million downloads. Sit with that trajectory for a moment, because if you know anything about the history of desktop Linux, it should feel genuinely strange. Ubuntu has existed since 2004, and while it did more than almost any distribution to simplify Linux installation for ordinary people, it never produced a mainstream migration story of this size in a single 6-month window. Linux Mint has been quietly excellent for well over 15 years, consistently praised by reviewers as one of the most stable and approachable desktop environments the open source world has produced. And it still moved at the patient, incremental pace this kind of software usually moves at. Fedora, Manjaro, and Pop. OS all built loyal, technically capable communities with real engineering behind them, and none of them produced a growth curve remotely like this in a comparable window. Desktop Linux has been trying to break into the mainstream for 3 decades, long enough that this is finally the year of the Linux desktop became a punchline. Nobody said unironically anymore, repeated so often across so many failed predictions that even people who wanted it to be true had mostly stopped believing it. And then, in the span of about 6 months, one distribution did something that 30 years of alternatives hadn't managed. Not through a technological leap nobody saw coming, but through timing, design discipline, and a deadline Microsoft had already put on the calendar years in advance. So why this one, and why now? The honest answer isn't really about Linux suddenly becoming dramatically more powerful overnight, because the kernel underneath Zorin OS 18 is the same Ubuntu 24.104 LTS foundation plenty of other distributions already use. The answer is about a very specific psychological barrier that every previous attempt at a mainstream Windows alternative ran straight into, and that Zorin's designers apparently understood better than anyone else building a desktop environment. For decades, the biggest thing keeping ordinary, non-technical Windows users away from Linux was never really about missing software or unfamiliar file formats. It was the fear of walking into a completely foreign room and not knowing where anything is. Boot into Zorin OS 18 for the first time as a longtime Windows user, and what greets you is a taskbar in the familiar spot, a start menu that behaves the way muscle memory expects, window snapping layouts, and a unified settings panel that doesn't require learning a new mental model just to change your screen brightness. It isn't a legally risky clone of Windows. It's something more deliberate, a careful distillation of exactly where 3 decades of Windows habit expects every interface element to live, wrapped in a visual style that still feels current rather than derivative. Reviewers who tested it independently kept describing the same experience. They braced for disorientation, the kind every previous Linux attempt eventually produced, and it simply didn't arrive, because everything was close enough to where instinct already pointed. That's a subtle but important distinction from what most previous Windows alternative projects tried to do. Earlier distributions often treated familiarity as a cosmetic afterthought, something you bolted on with a theme or an icon pack after the real engineering was finished. Zorin's team built the entire interface architecture around that psychological comfort from the ground up, treating the fear of walking into an unfamiliar room as the primary problem to solve rather than a secondary one. The installation process is where the design decisions get even more deliberate, because, historically, setup itself was the second major wall keeping casual users out entirely. For years, installing a Linux distribution could mean manually partitioning drives, hunting down proprietary graphics drivers, and dropping into a terminal window before you had a usable desktop, an experience that quietly filtered out anyone without technical patience to spare. Zorin OS 18 stripped almost all of that friction away. Its installer recognizes more than 170 common Windows application installers in first release and automatically suggests either a native Linux alternative or a compatible web-based equivalent, rather than leaving a new user to guess whether their software will even run. NVIDIA driver support arrives as a simple checkbox during setup instead of a manual download hunt, and the entire process uses plain language throughout, written for someone who has genuinely never touched Linux before, rather than someone who already understands what a package manager is. Then came Zorin OS 18.1 in April 2026, which pushed that migration tooling further still. The point release expanded the built-in Windows application detection database by more than 40%, bringing the total to over 240 recognized installers, moved to Linux kernel 6.17, the same kernel line shipping in the newest Ubuntu hardware enablement builds, and added support for Intel Arc graphics, AMD's hybrid laptop GPU designs, and handheld gaming devices including the Asus ROG Ally and the Lenovo Legion Go. A companion Zorin OS Lite edition, built around a lighter XFCE desktop rather than the heavier GNOME shell the main release uses, returned at the same time specifically to target older, lower-spec hardware, the exact kind of machine Windows 11 had just finished locking out. That detail matters more than it might first appear, because the Lite edition is effectively an admission that the project understands exactly who its new audience actually is. Not people shopping for the newest, most capable hardware on the market, but people trying to keep a 5, 8, or 10-year-old laptop alive and useful for a few more years without paying for a replacement they don't otherwise need. 6 months after the original launch, the momentum wasn't fading, it was compounding. But raw download figures only explain why people tried Zorin OS. They don't fully explain why so many of them apparently stayed, and that part of the story has less to do with any single feature Zorin has, and more to do with an accumulating list of things Windows increasingly does that Zorin simply doesn't. No advertisements embedded inside the Start menu or the File Manager, no AI assistant running persistently in the taskbar that nobody specifically asked to be there, no telemetry and data collection settings scattered across half a dozen menus in a way that a large vocal portion of the Windows user base has openly described as deliberately difficult to fully turn off, no forced account sign-in just to use hardware you already own outright, updates that install on your own schedule rather than a timer set by a company whose incentives don't always line up with yours. Individually, each of those complaints might sound like a minor annoyance you could live with. Stacked together across years of updates, they add up to something a lot of migration forum threads and Reddit communities kept circling back to as the actual, underlying reason people made the jump and then didn't reverse it. The difference between owning a computer outright and slowly feeling like you're renting the experience of using one from a company whose priorities have drifted further from yours every year. It's worth being precise about what that complaint actually is, because it isn't really about any single update or any one feature. It's cumulative. A person who bought a laptop in 2019 wasn't signing up for advertisements inside their file manager, a persistent AI assistant they never requested, or telemetry menus that required deliberate effort to fully disable. Those things arrived gradually, update by update, long after the purchase decision was already made, which is precisely why so many users online describe the feeling as a slow erosion of control rather than a single dramatic betrayal. Now, go back and look closely at the hardware wall itself, because it's the most concrete and least debatable part of this entire story. Canalys Research estimated that roughly 240 million PCs worldwide, close to a fifth of the entire global installed base, simply could not meet Windows 11's requirements no matter what their owners did to them. The most consequential of those requirements is the TPM 2.0 security chip, a component that handles encryption, secure key storage, and boot time integrity checks at the hardware level. It's a legitimate security feature, and few serious critics dispute that the technology itself is sound. The argument has always been about where Microsoft drew the cutoff. Windows 11 officially supports 8th generation Intel processors, released from 2017 onward, or AMD's Ryzen 2000 series and newer, which means a perfectly capable laptop bought in 2015 or 2016, genuinely premium hardware at the time, is categorically excluded regardless of how well it still runs everyday tasks today. Microsoft's public messaging to the owners of those 240 million machines arrived through exactly the kind of full-screen pop-ups that opened this story, encouraging them to buy a new PC, ideally a Copilot Plus model with dedicated AI processing hardware built directly into the chip. For someone whose old machine genuinely needed replacing anyway, that's a reasonable nudge. For someone sitting in front of a perfectly functional computer that simply happened to be built one product cycle too early, it landed very differently. And a lot of people spent the fall of 2025 discovering exactly which category they fell into. Windows 11 had technically existed since late 2021, giving Microsoft roughly 4 years of advance warning before Windows 10 support actually ended. And yet, the hardware requirement itself never moved to accommodate the enormous population of machines it excluded from day one. That's worth sitting with, because it means the collision that produced Zorin's download numbers wasn't a sudden surprise. It was a slow-moving deadline that a specific, well-positioned piece of software simply arrived in time to catch. And the hardware wall was only the first obstacle, because even users whose machines could technically run Windows 11 found an operating system that had changed in ways plenty of longtime users genuinely didn't want. Advertisements began appearing inside the Start menu and inside File Explorer, the core navigation layer of an operating system people had already paid for or received as a mandatory upgrade. Copilot, Microsoft's AI assistant, arrived as a persistent presence pinned directly into the taskbar for a large share of installations, whether the person using that machine had asked for it or not. For anyone who wanted to stay on Windows 10 a little longer instead of dealing with any of that, Microsoft did eventually offer a bridge. A consumer extended security updates program, priced at $30 for a full year of continued patches, or free if you were willing to sync your settings through a Microsoft account, or free if you redeemed 1,000 Microsoft rewards points instead. Businesses faced a steeper curve entirely, $61 per device in the first year, doubling to $122 in year 2, and doubling again to $244 in year 3, a cumulative cost that adds up fast across a fleet of machines. Microsoft has since quietly extended the consumer program a second time, pushing free and paid enrollment coverage out to October 12th, 2027, which softened some of the immediate pressure but didn't remove the underlying math. Paying every year to keep using hardware you already own on an operating system Microsoft itself is steering you away from is still a cost with no natural endpoint, and that's precisely the kind of ongoing bill a free one-time download doesn't carry. Map out the actual position a huge number of ordinary users found themselves in by late 2025, an incompatible machine through no fault of their own. A Windows 10 installation no longer receiving free security patches. A paid bridge program that costs money annually to keep using hardware Microsoft was simultaneously telling them to replace. Or an upgrade path to Windows 11 that comes bundled with advertisements in the file manager and an AI assistant they never requested. For a meaningful slice of that population, a free, familiar-looking alternative that had just landed in their search results at exactly the right moment stopped looking like a hobbyist's project and started looking like the obvious answer. The broader numbers back up just how widely that pressure was felt, beyond any single distribution. StatCounter recorded global Linux desktop share at 2.99% in April 2026, and by June 2026, that figure had climbed to 4.36%, with Windows falling to 56.61%, its first reading below 60% in years of tracking, though a meaningful caveat belongs right alongside that number. StatCounter's June dataset carried an unclassified unknown category covering more than a fifth of all global desktop traffic that month, which means some of that apparent Linux surge is likely reclassification rather than pure new migration, and later, corrected figures pulled Windows back up closer to 71% globally by midsummer. Year-end estimates for 2025 across multiple independent tracking methods put Linux desktop share as high as 4.7% worldwide, the highest level ever recorded for the platform. In North America specifically, StatCounter's July 2026 reading showed Linux crossing into double digits for the first time, briefly touching 10.65% before later corrections pulled the regional figure back down closer to 7.5% once more of that unclassified traffic got properly categorized. Individual countries told an even more varied story underneath the headline number. The United States had already crossed 5% on its own back in mid-2025, a threshold that had taken years of incremental growth to reach the first time, while India, driven by very different market dynamics around cost and hardware age, had been sitting well above that for years already. None of that noise erases the underlying signal. Even after every correction and every methodology caveat gets applied, the trend across every independent source still points the same direction, upward. And it has been pointing that way consistently since the exact month Windows 10 stopped receiving updates. On Valve's own Steam hardware survey, a separate population made up specifically of PC gamers, Linux hit 5.33% in March 2026, the highest share that survey has ever recorded, before settling back down over the following months. Windows, for context, still commands roughly 94% of Steam's installed base, which is worth stating plainly rather than glossing over. A distribution crossing 3.3 million downloads in 6 months is a genuinely remarkable achievement inside the history of Linux specifically. It is not, in raw numbers, a dent in Microsoft's overall installed base that anyone in Redmond is likely losing sleep over today. The gaming gap deserves the same honesty. Zorin OS runs Windows games through Valve's Proton compatibility layer, and while that compatibility picture has improved dramatically over the past several years, covering roughly 106,000 of Steam's approximately 118,000 total titles according to community tracking, it still isn't universal. Certain anti-cheat systems block Linux entirely by design, and specific competitive multiplayer titles simply won't launch no matter how current your kernel is. Zorin OS 18.1's expanded hardware support for handheld gaming devices signals the project is paying attention to that use case. But if your daily computing revolves around anti-cheat protected competitive titles, that's a real limitation worth knowing before you format a drive. It's also a limitation that's shrinking rather than growing, since Valve's own compatibility layer receives continuous engineering investment specifically because the Steam Deck depends on it, which means the games that don't work today are a smaller list than the games that didn't work 2 or 3 years ago. For the majority of people who've followed this story closely, though, the actual daily use case looks a lot less dramatic than gaming. Browsing, documents, spreadsheets, video calls, streaming, basic creative work, and email. Zorin OS 18 covers nearly all of that without meaningful compromise, and there's a structural shift underneath the whole conversation that makes the remaining gap narrower every year. The steady move toward browser-based tools, cloud documents, web-based creative suites, and even Microsoft's own Office 365 running through a browser tab has quietly dismantled one of Windows' most durable historical advantages. The old argument that you needed Windows specifically because that's where your software lived is measurably weaker in 2026 than it was even 4 years earlier, and a capable browser running on Zorin OS handles most of what people actually do daily, just as well as the same browser running on Windows 11, which raises the actual long-term question sitting underneath all of these download charts. Platform dominance has never really run on raw technical superiority alone. It runs on a network effect, developers building and testing for wherever meaningful numbers of users already are, hardware manufacturers certifying compatibility for whatever platform shows real demand, and software companies shifting their roadmaps toward wherever their customers actually sit. That exact mechanism kept Windows dominant for 3 decades, reinforced simply by the fact that everyone was already there. The uncomfortable question for Microsoft's long-term desktop strategy is whether that same mechanism can start running in the opposite direction, slowly, driven not by some dramatic Linux breakthrough, but by a steady accumulation of ordinary users, deciding the cost of staying had finally outpaced the cost of leaving. It's a question that doesn't get resolved by a single download milestone, however impressive, because network effects unwind slowly even after they start reversing. But every additional developer who tests their software on Linux because real users are now asking for it, every hardware manufacturer that certifies a component because demand justifies the engineering time, and every software company that notices a growing slice of its customer base sitting somewhere other than Windows adds another small brick to a foundation that simply didn't exist in any comparable way 5 years ago. What makes this particular moment different from every previous false alarm about Linux finally breaking through isn't the technology at all. It's the audience actually doing the switching. not developers rotating between environments they already understood, and not longtime enthusiasts who'd known the alternatives existed for years. Ordinary people holding onto older laptops that a hardware requirement excluded through no decision of their own, frustrated by advertisements appearing inside software they'd already paid for, and increasingly interested in a computer that responded to their instructions without quietly negotiating around them. Those are exactly the users that platform incumbents have always assumed were too comfortable with muscle memory to seriously leave. And that assumption is being tested in real time by download numbers that historically weren't supposed to be possible in this space. None of this happened because desktop Linux suddenly became unrecognizable from the platform it's been for years. It happened because since October 14th, 2025, Windows 10 has stopped receiving free security patches. Every newly discovered vulnerability on that platform now stays permanently open for anyone still running it. And a hardware wall excluded roughly 240 million otherwise functional machines from the officially supported path forward. Combine that with advertisements inside paid software, an AI assistant pushed into the taskbar without being requested, and a support cutoff that left people choosing between a recurring payment and hardware they didn't actually need, and the cost of staying crossed a threshold for a meaningful number of ordinary users at almost the exact moment a genuinely accessible alternative happened to be standing at the door. Zorin OS didn't have to become perfect to capture those users. It had to be familiar enough, accessible enough, and simply ready at exactly the right moment. And based on everything the 18.1 release in April 2026 suggests, the team building it understands that the window they walked through in October isn't closing anytime soon. It's still very much open, and every additional month of Windows 10 running unpatched somewhere in the world keeps it propped open a little wider. If you're on the fence about trying any of this yourself, here's the genuinely practical version. Dual booting costs nothing but a little time. Installing from a USB drive typically takes under an hour, and it leaves your existing Windows installation completely untouched while you decide whether the alternative actually fits how you work. The honest answer might be that Windows still makes more sense for your specific setup, given the software you already rely on, the peripherals you already own, or simply how much time you have to spend testing something new, and that's a completely legitimate outcome to land on. But the answer might also turn out to be that the thing you'd spent years assuming would be complicated and unfamiliar is considerably easier than the version of it you'd been imagining. If this gave you something worth thinking about, consider leaving a like, since it genuinely helps research-driven coverage like this reach people who'd actually find it useful. And if you're curious how this particular story develops over the next year, since the next real chapter of the Windows versus Linux desktop question is going to be determined over the coming 12 to 18 months, stick around for that coverage. Let me know in the comments if you've made the switch since Windows 10 support ended, and if you tried Zorin OS specifically, what was the exact moment you realized it was actually going to work for you, and what almost talked you out of trying it in the first place.